The singleton pattern is a widely used design pattern in software development. Despite its popularity, it's often considered an anti-pattern. Why is that? In this episode, I explain what the singleton pattern entails and how to create singletons in Swift. Singletons are easy to understand. The singleton pattern guarantees that only one instance of a class is instantiated. That's simple, right? If you've worked with Apple's frameworks, then chances are that you've already used the singleton pattern. Take a look at these examples. They probably look familiar. The singleton pattern is a very useful pattern. There are times that you want to make sure only one instance of a class is instantiated, and that your application only uses that instance. That's the primary and only goal of the singleton pattern. The default payment queue of the StoreKit framework is a fine example. An application should never create an instance of the SK payment queue class. The operating system uses the StoreKit framework to create a payment queue, which your application can use. The default payment queue is accessible through the default class method of the SK payment queue class. This is a good example of how the singleton pattern should be applied. But the singleton pattern has a side effect that's often the true reason for adopting the singleton pattern: global access. But having global access to the singleton object is no more than a side effect of the singleton pattern. Unfortunately, many developers use the singleton pattern to have easy access to the singleton object from anywhere in their project. The default payment queue is accessible through the default class method. This means that any object in a project can access the default payment queue. While this is convenient, that convenience comes at a price. If you want to learn more about the problems surrounding the singleton pattern, then I recommend reading Are Singletons Bad? In that article, I discuss this topic in more detail. In this episode, I list 2 recipes for implementing the singleton pattern in Swift. The first implementation shouldn't be used though. It merely illustrates a few concepts of the Swift language. The most straightforward technique to create a singleton is by defining a global variable. By defining a variable in the global namespace of the project, any object in the module has access to the singleton object. We could, for example, access the singleton object in the application.didFinishLaunchingWithOptions method of the appDelegate class. In Swift, global variables are initialized lazily. This means that the initializer is run the first time the global variable is referenced. An added benefit of Swift's approach is that the initialization is performed using the dispatch-once function. It guarantees that the initializer is invoked only once. That's important, since you only want to initialize the singleton object once. Using a global variable has several shortcomings. The most important problem is cluttering the global namespace. Another downside is that the initializer of the Network Manager class cannot be declared private. This means that multiple instances of the class can be instantiated. Let me show you a much better and my preferred implementation in Swift. A few years ago, Swift introduced static properties and access control to the language. This opened up an alternative approach to implementing the singleton pattern in Swift. It's much cleaner and elegant than using a global variable. Take a look at the updated example. Accessing the singleton is intuitive and it clearly conveys that we're dealing with a singleton. Several implementation details have changed. First, the initializer is private. It means that only the Network Manager class can create instances of itself. That's a significant advantage. Second, we declared the shared static constant property. This property gives other objects access to the singleton object of the Network Manager class. It isn't necessary to mark static properties with the lazy keyword. Remember what I said earlier, the initializer of global variables and static properties are executed lazily by default. That's another benefit. I want to share one more implementation of the singleton pattern. This implementation is a bit more complex. The main difference is that the singleton object is instantiated in a closure, allowing for a more complex initialization and configuration of the singleton object. The static property is declared private. The singleton object is accessible through the shared class method. With these implementations in mind, we have mimicked the interface many Cocoa frameworks have adopted in Swift. In our singletons bat, I explain in detail what type of problems the singleton pattern can introduce in a project. My advice is to use singletons sparingly, very sparingly. If you're about to create a singleton, then take a moment and step back. Is there another option you may be overlooking? Is it absolutely necessary to use the singleton pattern? Even though there's nothing inherently wrong with singletons, most developers use it for the wrong reasons. That is, convenience. They disguise global variables as singletons. Even if you decide to use singletons in a project, that doesn't mean you have to access them from anywhere in your project. You can still use dependency injection to pass the singleton object to the objects that need it. By adopting dependency injection to pass singletons around, the interface of your class remains clear and transparent. In other words, the interface of the class describes its dependencies. This is very useful. It immediately shows which objects the class needs to perform its duties. One of the things I miss about Objective-C is the header file. The header file summarizes the public interface of a class, including the dependencies of the class. This is sometimes less obvious in Swift. If you want to learn more about the Swift patterns I use in my projects, then download the free book I wrote to help you improve the code you write. Learn the 4 Swift patterns I swear by is a free download, and it has helped thousands of developers step up their game with 4 easy to implement patterns. Visit cococast.com/patterns to download the book. Drop me a line if you have any questions or feedback. I'd love to hear from you.